Wyoming Territory, 1872. The silence was the first thing a man learned to live without here. It was a physical presence, a weight in the air that settled over the vast, rolling plains and pressed down on the shoulders. Jacob Thorne had not only learned to live with it, he had come to crave it. Silence was honest. It made no promises it could not keep and told no lies. It was a clean, empty canvas against which the only sounds were the ones a man made himself. The creak of saddle leather, the low nicker of a horse, the sharp, definitive crack of a rifle. His world was one of order, carved from the unforgiving land through sheer will and the sweat of his own brow. From the porch of the sturdy cabin he had built with his own two hands, he watched the sun begin its slow descent, painting the western sky in brutal strokes of orange and violet. The wind, a constant companion in this high country, whispered through the tall pines that guarded his homestead, a lonely sigh that echoed the hollow space in his chest. He had filled that space with work, with the rhythm of seasons, with the solitude he had mistaken for peace. He was 34 years old, though the lines etched around his eyes and the quiet gravity in his posture made him seem older. They were lines carved not by years, but by loss. Down the gentle slope from his cabin, a patch of land lay fallow, marked by a single, defiant stone chimney. It was all that remained of his first home, a place of laughter and light that had been devoured by a fire 5 years ago. The flames had taken everything: the home, his wife Sarah, their infant son. The silence that followed that night had been a roaring, deafening thing. He had fought it, then surrendered to it, and finally embraced it as a shield. Attachments were tender, he had learned. Love was a spark that could burn a man's world to ash. He would not build that pyre again. He drew a long, slow breath, the air sharp and clean with the scent of pine and distant rain. His gaze drifted east toward the thin, dark line of the horizon where the Union Pacific rails cut through the territory. He did not need to see it to know it was there. Twice a week, the train was a punctuation mark in the endless sentence of the plains, a brief intrusion of the noisy, complicated world he had left behind. He could hear its whistle on a clear day, a faint, mournful cry that stirred nothing in him but a distant memory of impatience. But today, the sound that reached him was different. It was closer, sharper. He stood, his body tensing with the ingrained caution of a man who lived alone in a world that was not always friendly. It was the train's whistle, yes, but it was followed by the rhythmic clatter of wheels on steel, growing steadily louder. It was arriving, a metal serpent breathing steam and smoke into the pristine air, disrupting the sacred quiet of his afternoon. For a moment, a flicker of annoyance crossed his face. It was just a machine, a thing of noise and people, and it had no place in his well-ordered solitude. Yet he found himself watching the plume of smoke rise against the bruised sky, a premonition, cold and unwelcome, prickling the back of his neck. The silence was about to be broken. Eleanor Vance stepped down from the passenger car and onto the rough-hewn planks of the platform, her grip tight on the handle of her valise. The train hissed behind her, a great, panting beast eager to be on its way. Dust, fine as powdered gold, swirled around the hem of her dark green traveling dress, a garment made for the civilized streets of Boston, not the raw, untamed expanse that stretched before her in every direction. The town of Redemption Creek was little more than a single, wide street flanked by a dozen wooden buildings, all of them looking weathered and temporary, as if they might be swept away by the next strong wind. She scanned the small crowd on the platform, a few rough-looking men in dusty hats, a woman with 2 small children, a station master with a weary expression, but saw no one who looked like the man she was meant to meet. A Mr. Harrington. The correspondence had been polite, formal. He required a governess for his 2 young daughters, a woman of good breeding and education. The position came with a handsome salary and passage west. For Eleanor, orphaned and with her inheritance dwindling, it had felt like Providence. Now, standing under the immense, indifferent sky, a seed of doubt began to sprout in the fertile ground of her exhaustion. Jacob had come to town for salt and flour, nothing more. He had intended to be in and out of the general store in minutes, to exchange a few terse words with Mr. Henderson, and retreat back to the sanctuary of his ranch. But the train's arrival had delayed him. He stood beside his wagon, watching the disembarking passengers with a detached curiosity. They were the usual sort, prospectors with feverish eyes, homesteaders with more hope than sense, a few soldiers returning to the nearby fort. And then he saw her. She was like a splash of vibrant color on a faded canvas. Her dress was the deep, rich green of a forest after a rain, a color he had not realized he missed. Her hair, the color of warm honey, was coiled neatly at the nape of her neck, though a few rebellious strands had escaped to catch the afternoon light. She stood with a straight-back posture that spoke of discipline and refinement. Yet there was a vulnerability in the way her eyes searched the faces in the small crowd, a flicker of uncertainty that she tried and failed to conceal. He felt an immediate, unwelcome pull of something he had long since buried. It was the instinct to protect, a dangerous, foolish impulse he had sworn off forever. He turned away, loading his sacks into the wagon with sharp, angry movements. It was not his concern. Eleanor approached the station master, a man whose face seemed to be made of wrinkled leather. "Excuse me, sir," she began, her voice clearer and steadier than she felt. "I am looking for a Mr. Harrington. He was to meet me here." The man pushed his hat back and scratched his head, his gaze lingering on her fine clothes. "Harrington, you say?" "Can't say I know the name. Lived here 10 years. Know every man, woman, and child in a 50-mile radius. No Harringtons." The seed of doubt blossomed into a cold flower of dread in her stomach. "But the letters. He wrote from Redemption Creek. He has a ranch with 2 daughters. The station master shook his head slowly, a look of pity in his eyes. "Ma'am, the only ranch of any size round here with young uns belongs to the widow Abernathy, and her girls are nearly grown. Silas Croft has a big spread, but he's a bachelor. I'm sorry, there's no Mr. Harrington here." The platform seemed to tilt beneath her feet. The noise of the departing train, its bell clanging a final, mocking farewell, faded to a dull roar in her ears. She was stranded, alone, in a place that felt more foreign than any country on a map, with dwindling funds and a lie that had brought her 2,000 miles from everything she had ever known. She clutched her valise, her knuckles white, her carefully constructed composure threatening to shatter like glass against stone. Jacob saw the exchange from across the street. He saw the woman's shoulders slump, the proud tilt of her chin falter. He saw the station master's sympathetic shrug. He cursed under his breath. He should get in his wagon and go. He should drive back to his quiet cabin and let the world handle its own messes. But his feet, betraying the cold resolve of his mind, began to move. He crossed the dusty street, his boot heels leaving deep prints in the dirt. He stopped a few feet from her, close enough to smell the faint scent of lavender that clung to her clothes, a scent that was jarringly out of place amidst the town smells of dust, manure, and coal smoke. "You have a problem, ma'am?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. Eleanor looked up at him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that looked as if it had been carved from the granite of the nearby mountains. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, were startlingly direct, missing nothing. There was a hardness about him, a self-contained stillness that was both intimidating and, strangely, reassuring. "It seems," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "that I have been the victim of a cruel deception." Just then, the sky, which had been darkening for the last hour, opened up. A cold, hard rain began to fall, turning the dust to mud in an instant. The few people remaining on the street scattered for cover. The world seemed to shrink to the small space beneath the station's narrow overhang. Jacob looked at the woman, her fine dress now spotted with rain, her face pale with shock and disillusionment. He looked at the empty road stretching out of town. He looked at the darkening sky. He let out a heavy sigh, a sound of profound resignation. His silence was well and truly broken. "The next train east isn't for 3 days," he stated, the words flat and practical. "You can't stay here. The hotel is no place for a lady alone. It was less a hotel and more a boarding house with a saloon on the ground floor, filled with men whose intentions were rarely honorable. "My ranch is 5 miles out. I have a housekeeper. You'll be safe there." It was not a question, but a statement of fact. Eleanor looked into his unyielding gray eyes and saw no guile, only a reluctant decency. She was a woman of propriety, of caution, but the rules of Boston society seemed a flimsy, useless guide in this harsh new reality. She had no other choice. She gave a single, sharp nod. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne," he supplied, his tone clipped. "Jacob Thorne." He took her valise from her hand. The weight of it surprised him, as did the brief brush of her fingers against his. Her skin was soft, a stark contrast to his own calloused palm. The contact was fleeting, accidental, but it sent a jolt through him, an unwelcome flicker of warmth in the cold, guarded fortress of his heart. He turned abruptly and strode toward his wagon, the small, heavy bag feeling like a monumental burden in his hand. The ride to the ranch was a study in jarring motion and unspoken tension. The wagon wheels groaned in protest as they churned through the quickly deepening mud, and the rain fell in a steady, relentless sheet. Eleanor held onto the side of the wagon bench, her knuckles white, tried to maintain her composure as she was jostled against the solid form of the man beside her. Jacob Thorne drove the team with an economy of movement, his expression unreadable, his gaze fixed on a muddy track ahead. The silence between them was thick, broken only by the drumming of the rain and the snorting of the horses. Eleanor stole glances at him from beneath the brim of her bonnet. His profile was stark against the gray landscape, a study in hard lines and angles. He seemed a part of this land, as rugged and unyielding as the mountains that loomed in the distance. She felt a tremor of fear, not of him, but of the immense, raw power of the world she had entered, a world for which her life of books and quiet drawing rooms had not prepared her. Yet, there was something in his quiet competence, in the steady way he handled the horses through the storm, that calmed the frantic beating of her heart. "Why would someone do such a thing?" she asked, the question breaking into the quiet. "Lure me all the way out here with a false promise." Jacob kept his eyes on the road. "Land," he said, the single word hanging in the air. "Or water. Or maybe just pure meanness. Some men don't need a good reason to be cruel." He offered no further explanation, and Eleanor felt it would be an intrusion to ask for one. He was a man who dealt in facts, not speculation. They finally crested a rise, and she saw the ranch spread out below them in a shallow valley. A sturdy log cabin with smoke curling from its stone chimney sat nestled in a grove of pines. A large barn and several corrals stood nearby. A creek, swollen with rain, snaked through the property. It was an island of order in a sea of wilderness, and for the first time since stepping off the train, Eleanor felt a flicker of something other than fear. It felt safe. As they pulled up before the cabin, the front door opened and a woman stepped onto the porch. She was older, with graying hair pulled into a severe bun and a face etched with kindness. She held a shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. "Jacob, I was starting to worry," she called out, her voice warm and practical. Her eyes widened slightly as she took in Eleanor, soaked and shivering on the wagon seat. "Trouble in town, Martha," Jacob said as he climbed down and came around to help Eleanor. He placed his hands on her waist to lift her down, and again she was struck by the contrast between his rough, powerful grip and the careful way he handled her, as if she were made of porcelain. For a brief moment, as her feet touched the muddy ground, she stumbled, her hand flying out to brace herself against his chest. She could feel the solid warmth of him through his wet shirt, the steady, slow beat of his heart beneath her palm. He froze, his hands still at her waist, his stormy eyes locking with hers. The world seemed to fall away, leaving only the sound of the rain and the charged space between them. It was an intimacy that was both terrifying and profound. He broke the contact first, stepping back as if burned, his expression shuddered once more. "This is Miss Vance," he said to Martha, his voice strained. "She's been stranded. She'll be staying with us until the next train." Martha's gaze was sharp and knowing. She looked from Jacob's rigid posture to Eleanor's flushed face and seemed to understand more than was said. She simply nodded and ushered Eleanor inside. "Coming out of the wet, child. Let's get you warm." The inside of the cabin was a single large room, dominated by a massive stone fireplace where a cheerful fire crackled and spat. It was clean, masculine, and sparsely furnished, but Martha's presence had softened the edges with braided rugs and handmade quilts. The air smelled of wood smoke, leather, and brewing coffee. It was the scent of a home. Martha led Eleanor to a small room partitioned off from the main area, offering her dry clothes and a thick towel. Left alone, Eleanor sank onto the edge of the simple bed. The day's events washed over her in a dizzying wave. She was in a stranger's home, a man whose touch had unsettled her more than any of the dangers she had imagined. A man who lived in a fortress of solitude and had, for reasons she could not fathom, opened its gates to her. She pressed a hand to her chest, where the phantom feeling of his heartbeat still seemed to echo. She had come west seeking a position, a way to survive. She had found herself in a situation far more complicated and far more compelling than she could ever have anticipated. Dinner was a quiet affair. Martha served a hearty beef stew, and the warmth of the food began to chase away the last of Eleanor's chill. She sat across the simple wooden table from Jacob, acutely aware of his presence. He ate with a focused intensity, as if the act of sustenance was just another task to be completed efficiently. He answered her polite questions about the ranch with brief, factual responses, his words as spare as the landscape outside. "The winters are harsh," he said, in response to her query about the seasons. "The land demands respect." "It is beautiful, though," she offered, glancing toward the window, where the rain had softened to a gentle patter. "There is a wildness to it, a grandeur I have never seen." For the first time, his gaze softened. He looked past her, out into the gathering dusk. "It is," he agreed, his voice a low rumble. "It doesn't pretend to be anything it's not." In that simple statement, Eleanor heard a world of meaning. He was speaking of the land, but he was also speaking of himself. After the meal, Martha shooed them both toward the fire while she cleared the dishes. "You two sit," she commanded gently. "A body needs to rest after a day like this." Eleanor sat in a sturdy armchair near the hearth, extending her hands toward the flames. Jacob remained standing, one arm resting on the mantelpiece, staring down into the fire, as if searching for answers in the dancing flames. The silence stretched, but it was different now. It was a comfortable, shared quiet, warmed by the firelight that cast flickering shadows on the walls and on the hard planes of his face. "I am in your debt, Mr. Thorne," Eleanor said softly, breaking the stillness. "You have shown me a great kindness." "It was nothing," he said, not looking at her. "Couldn't leave you to the wolves. Nevertheless, I appreciate it." She hesitated, then forged ahead, driven by a need to understand the man who had rescued her. "Martha mentioned you built this cabin yourself." He nodded, his jaw tight. "I did. It is very well made. Strong. It has to be." His gaze flickered toward the far end of the property, toward the place she could not see in the darkness, where the lone chimney stood like a tombstone. A deep, profound sadness washed over his features, so raw and unguarded that it made her breath catch in her throat. He seemed to forget she was there, lost in a memory that was clearly agonizing. I lost my parents last year," Eleanor found herself saying, the words spilling out into the quiet space between them. "A fever took them both within a week. It is a strange feeling to be so suddenly alone in the world, to have the foundation of your life simply gone." Her confession seemed to pull him back from the precipice of his own grief. He finally turned his head and looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time, she saw past the stoic frontiersman to the wounded man beneath. His stormy eyes were filled with a shared understanding of loss. "I know the feeling," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer suppress. He took a deep, shuddering breath. "I had a wife, Sarah, and a son, little Sam." He spoke the names as if they were fragile things, easily broken. We had a smaller cabin down by the creek. An ember from the hearth a windy night. It happened so fast he stopped, unable to continue, his hand clenching into a fist on the mantel. The air in the room grew heavy with the weight of his unspoken pain. Eleanor's own sorrow seemed a small, pale thing next to the inferno of his. Her heart ached for him, for the terrible tragedy that had forged his solitude. "I am so sorry," she whispered, the words utterly inadequate. He gave a short, sharp nod, a gesture of dismissal that was meant to close the subject, to rebuild the walls she had just breached. But the crack was there. A small, vital connection had been forged in the crucible of their shared vulnerability. He had let her see the chink in his armor, and she had seen not weakness, but a profound and heartbreaking strength. He was a man who had endured the unthinkable and had simply kept going. She did not press him further. They sat in silence as the fire burned low, the quiet no longer a barrier, but a shared space of mourning and nascent understanding. He was a man defined by what he had lost, and she was a woman adrift, searching for a place to belong. In the warm, firelit cabin, surrounded by the vast, dark wilderness of Wyoming, these two solitary souls had found a fragile, unexpected common ground. The next few days passed in a strange, suspended reality. The rain cleared, replaced by a brilliant, high-altitude sun that made the wet earth steam and the landscape glitter. Eleanor found herself falling into the quiet rhythm of the ranch. She helped Martha with the chores, her soft hands slowly growing accustomed to the work. She learned the feel of kneading dough, the satisfaction of a well-swept floor, the simple peace of hanging laundry in the clean, pine-scented air. She watched Jacob from a distance. She saw the way he moved with an innate grace and power, whether he was mending a fence line, calming a skittish horse, or chopping wood with a steady, hypnotic rhythm. He was a man in his element, a man whose hands knew how to build and to mend. He spoke little, but she began to learn his language. The slight tightening of his jaw that meant he was worried about the weather, the brief, almost imperceptible softening of his eyes when he watched one of the newborn calves, the way he would stand on the porch at dusk, a silent sentinel guarding his small kingdom. He, in turn, found himself watching her. He had expected her to be a fragile, helpless thing, a delicate bird unsuited for this harsh environment. He was surprised by her resilience. She did not complain. She learned quickly, her brow furrowed in concentration as Martha showed her how to churn butter. He saw her one afternoon sitting on the porch steps, carefully mending one of his work shirts, her stitches small and neat. It was a simple domestic act, but it struck him with the force of a physical blow. It was a ghost of a life he had thought buried forever. Her presence was a constant, low-level disruption to his carefully ordered world. The cabin no longer felt empty. It smelled of baking bread and lavender. Her voice, when she spoke with Martha, was a soft, musical sound that carried on the breeze. He found himself listening for it. He found himself looking for the splash of green of her dress as she walked by the creek. This awareness unnerved him. It was a vulnerability he could not afford, a crack in the dam of his resolve. One evening, he returned from a long day riding the property line to find her sitting by the corral, sketching in a small leather-bound book. She was so absorbed in her work that she did not hear his approach. He stopped, watching her. The setting sun lit her honey-colored hair, turning it to a halo of gold. Her face was serene, her expression one of deep concentration. "What are you drawing?" he asked, his voice startling her. She looked up, a faint blush rising in her cheeks. "Oh, Mr. Thorne, you surprised me." She held up the book. It was a remarkably detailed sketch of his best mare, an intelligent, temperamental horse named Shadow. She had captured the animal's spirit perfectly, the proud arch of her neck, the intelligence in her dark eyes. He took the book she offered, his rough fingers surprisingly gentle as they handled the delicate pages. He was taken aback by her talent. "This is good," he said, the praise sounding grudging even to his own ears. "Very good. My father taught me," she explained. He believed that to truly see something, You must try to draw it. It forces you to notice the details. She looked from the sketch to the horse, and then back to him. This is a beautiful place, Mr. Thorne. You have made a good life here. It's a hard life, he countered, handing the book back to her, eager to retreat behind his usual defenses. I'm beginning to think, she said, her gaze direct and challenging, that all the best things are. Her words stayed with him long after he went inside. He had built his life on the principle of avoiding hardship, or at least the emotional hardship of attachment. He had chosen the path of least resistance, a solitary path that offered no chance of joy, but also no risk of the soul-searing pain of loss. Eleanor Vance, with her quiet strength and her artist's eye, was forcing him to see the details he had chosen to ignore, the profound emptiness of his own existence. The first sign of real trouble came a week after Eleanor's arrival. Sheriff Brody, a man whose weathered face told the history of the territory, rode out to the ranch. Jacob met him on the porch, offering him a cup of coffee. Just thought I'd check in, Jake, the sheriff said, his eyes troubled. There's been a couple of hard cases in town, asking questions. Jacob's body went still. What kind of questions? Asking about a woman. An Easterner. Arrived on the train last week. Brody took a sip of his coffee, his gaze sharp. They matched the description of two men wanted for claim jumping up in the Black Hills. Hired muscle. Name of Jed and Marcus. They work for anyone with coin, and their boss is usually Silas Croft. The name landed like a stone in Jacob's gut. Silas Croft was the wealthiest rancher in the territory, a man whose ambition was as vast as the land he coveted. He owned the sprawling acreage to the north, but his land was dry. Jacob's ranch, the Double Pine, was smaller, but had the one thing Crofts lacked, the unwavering flow of Redemption Creek. Croft had tried to buy him out twice. Jacob had refused. He wants my water, Jacob said, the pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. He lured Miss Vance out here. As leverage, the sheriff mused. Or distraction. Either way, it's a snake's move. This woman, she's here. Jacob nodded grimly. She is. Be watchful, Jake, Brody warned, setting his cup down. Croft is a patient man, but he's not a forgiving one. These men he hires, they aren't patient at all. After the sheriff left, a cold fury settled over Jacob. Eleanor was not just a victim of a random cruelty. She was a pawn in a greedy man's game. And by bringing her to his ranch, he had placed her directly in the path of danger. The instinct to protect, the one he had fought so hard to suppress, rose in him, fierce and undeniable. He would have to send her away. It was the only way to keep her safe. The thought of the cabin returning to its former silence, of not seeing her by the fire or hearing her soft voice, left a hollow ache in his chest that he angrily dismissed as a weakness. He found her by the creek, gathering smooth, flat stones. He did not know why she was gathering them, and he did not ask. The train comes through tomorrow, he said without preamble, his voice harsh. I'll take you into town. She looked up, her hands full of stones, her expression one of surprise and hurt. Tomorrow? But I thought I could stay, perhaps find work in town, until I have enough to. There is no work for you here, he cut in, his tone brutal. He had to be cruel to be kind, to make her want to leave. This is no place for you. You belong back east, in your world of drawing rooms and books. The color drained from her face. She stood slowly, letting the stones fall from her hands. I see, she said, her voice quiet and strained. I have overstayed my welcome. Forgive me for being a burden. It's not about being a burden, he ground out, frustrated by his inability to explain, by the walls he had built so high he could no longer see over them himself. It's about being safe. Safe from what? She challenged, her spirit flaring. From the disappointment of being deceived? From the hardship of making my own way? Or from you, Mr. Thorne? Are you so eager to be rid of me that you would cast me out without a second thought? You don't understand, he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. There are men looking for you. Dangerous men. As long as you are here, you are in their sights. And what of you? She shot back, taking a step closer, her eyes flashing with a fire he had never seen before. These men, they are a threat because of your land, are they not? Because of this Silas Croft? Am I simply another piece of property you feel obligated to protect and then discard?" Her words hit their mark, striking at the heart of his own internal conflict. He saw himself through her eyes, a cold, unfeeling man pushing her away not for her safety, but for his own peace of mind. The truth was he was terrified. He was terrified of the danger she was in, but he was more terrified of what he was beginning to feel for her. She was a light in his desolate world, and he could not bear the thought of that light being extinguished, or worse, of being the cause of it. "I'm sending you away because I will not have another death on my conscience," he said, the words torn from him, raw and bleeding. He turned his back on her, unable to face the wounded look in her eyes. "Be ready to leave at dawn." He strode back to the cabin, leaving her standing alone by the creek. The forced separation, the wall he had just violently rebuilt between them, felt less like a shield and more like a wound. He had done what he believed was right, what was necessary to protect her, but it felt like he had just torn out a vital part of himself and thrown it away. The next morning dawned cold and gray, a mirror of the mood that had settled over the ranch. Eleanor was packed, her single valise sitting by the door. She had not spoken a word to him since their confrontation by the creek. The silence in the cabin was no longer peaceful. It was a tense, aching void. Martha moved about the kitchen with a disapproving set to her mouth, her clattering pans an eloquent commentary on her thoughts about Jacob's decision. He hitched the team to the wagon, his movements jerky and efficient. Every action felt like a betrayal. He was sending away the first bit of warmth that had entered his life in 5 years. He told himself it was for the best. He told himself it was the only way. The words were hollow, tasteless lies. Eleanor came out onto the porch, dressed in the same green traveling suit she had arrived in. She looked pale, but resolute. She handed him a small, wrapped package. "What is this?" he asked, his voice rough. "It is the shirt I mended for you," she said, her voice cool and distant. "And a loaf of the bread Martha taught me to bake. A small payment for your hospitality. She would not be in his debt." He understood. It was a matter of pride. He took the package, his fingers brushing hers for a final, fleeting moment. He threw it onto the wagon seat with more force than necessary and turned to help her up. She avoided his hand, climbing up on her own, her movements stiff. They started down the track toward town in a silence that was heavier and more suffocating than any storm. They had not gone more than a mile when Jacob's instincts screamed at him. A flicker of movement in the aspens on the ridge to their right. The unnatural silence of the birds. He reined in the horses, his hand moving instinctively toward the rifle resting by his side. "What is it?" Eleanor asked, her voice tight with alarm. Before he could answer, 2 riders spurred their horses out of the trees, blocking the path ahead. They were the men the sheriff had described, rough, hard-faced, with the dead-eyed look of men who lived by violence. One of them, a burly man with a thick beard, grinned unpleasantly. "Well now, Jed," he said to his companion, "looks like Mr. Thorne is saving us the trouble of a visit, and he's brought the pretty little package with him." "Croft wants a word," said the second man, Jed, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "And he wants a lady. Says she has something that belongs to him." "She has nothing that belongs to him," Jacob said, his voice dangerously calm. He kept his hands in plain sight, his mind racing, calculating angles and odds. 2 of them, one of him, but they had not counted on Eleanor. "The boss says different," Marcus sneered. "Now, you can hand her over nice and easy, Thorne, and we'll just rough you up a bit. Or you can make it difficult, and we'll leave you for the coyotes. Your choice." Jacob knew there was no choice. They would not leave him alive either way. He met Eleanor's eyes. He saw fear there, but beneath it, a flicker of the same fire she had shown him by the creek. He gave her a barely perceptible nod. "She's not going anywhere with you," Jacob said, his voice ringing with finality. As Marcus's grin widened and his hand went for his gun, Jacob moved with blinding speed. He launched himself off the wagon, grabbing the rifle as he went, and rolled behind the meager cover of the front wheel. A shot rang out, splintering the wood where he had been sitting a second before. At the same instant, Eleanor reacted. She did not scream or cower. With a cry of pure defiance, she grabbed the heavy package she had given him, the mended shirt wrapped around the dense, solid loaf of bread, and hurled it with all her might at Jed's face. It struck him squarely, the unexpected impact and weight of it knocking him off balance in his saddle. His horse shied violently, and his own shot went wide, whistling harmlessly into the sky. That split second of diversion was all Jacob needed. He brought the rifle to his shoulder and fired. The shot was clean, precise. Jed cried out and clutched his arm, dropping his pistol into the mud as his horse bolted. Marcus, enraged, spurred his horse forward, firing wildly at the wagon. Eleanor scrambled over the seat and into the wagon bed, seeking cover behind the sacks of flour. A bullet tore through one, sending a puff of white powder into the air like a ghost. Jacob fired again, aiming for the horse this time. He did not want to kill the man, not if he could avoid it, but he would not hesitate if Eleanor's life was at stake. The bullet struck the horse in the foreleg. The animal screamed and went down, throwing Marcus hard to the ground. The man landed with a sickening thud, his leg twisted beneath him at an unnatural angle. He lay groaning in the mud, his gun several feet from his outstretched hand. The fight was over as quickly as it had begun. A profound silence descended, broken only by the man's groans and the heavy panting of Jacob's own horses. Jacob rose slowly from behind the wheel, his rifle still trained on the fallen man. He walked over and kicked the pistol further away. Jed had disappeared over the ridge, a wounded coward. Eleanor cautiously peered over the side of the wagon. Her face was smudged with flour, her eyes wide with shock and adrenaline. Are you hurt?" she asked, her voice trembling. "No," he said, his gaze fixed on her. He looked at the burst sack of flour, the splintered wood of the wagon seat, and a cold, terrible realization washed over him. He had almost gotten her killed. His plan to send her away for her own safety had led her directly into an ambush. His attempt to protect her by pushing her away had been the most dangerous thing he could have done. He strode back to her, his face a mask of grim self-recrimination. He reached into the wagon and lifted her out, his hands gentle but firm on her arms. He set her on the ground and looked down at her, his stormy eyes filled with a terrifying mix of relief and fury. "This is my fault," he said, his voice raw. "I should have never tried to send you away. I should have kept you at the ranch, where I could watch over you. You thought you were protecting me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She reached up and brushed a speck of flour from his cheek, her touch feather-light. His control snapped. The carefully constructed walls he had spent 5 years building crumbled to dust. "Protecting you?" he asked, his voice breaking. He gripped her arms, not with anger, but with a desperate intensity. "Eleanor, when I saw them aim their guns at you, I realized protecting you isn't a choice. It isn't a duty. It is as necessary to me as breathing. I was a fool. I thought my solitude was strength, but it's just an empty room. You walked into that room and turned on a light I thought had burned out forever." He stared at her, the truth of his feelings laid bare in the stark morning light. He had spent years guarding his heart, convinced that love was a weakness that led only to pain. But in that moment of shared danger, he understood. The real weakness was a life lived in fear of feeling anything at all. He had been dead for 5 years. Eleanor Vance, with her quiet courage and her unwavering gaze, had just brought him back to life. He did not take her to town. Instead, he tied the groaning man, Marcus, securely and loaded him into the back of the wagon, then turned the team around and headed back to the Double Pine. The retreat to his fortress was no longer about hiding from the world. It was about defending what had, against all odds, become his world. Back at the ranch, Martha's face was a storm of worry until she saw they were both unharmed. Jacob sent one of the young ranch hands, a boy named Tim he had hired for the summer, to ride to town and bring back Sheriff Brody. Then, he led Eleanor into the cabin. He turned to face her in the middle of the room, the place where they had first shared their stories of loss. The air was thick with unspoken words, with the aftermath of violence and the shock of revelation. "They will be back," he said, his voice low and certain. "Croft won't give up that easily. He'll send more men." "What will we do?" she asked, her gaze steady on his. She was not asking for rescue now. She was asking as a partner. The shared danger had forged a new bond between them, stronger than sympathy, deeper than attraction. It was the bond of survivors. "We'll be ready for them," he said. He looked around the cabin, his cabin, which had become their sanctuary. It was no longer just a shelter from the elements. It was a home he would defend with his life. "The logs are thick. The windows are small. It was built to withstand storm. We'll give them 1 inch." As dusk fell, a nervous energy settled over the ranch. Sheriff Brody had arrived with a single deputy, a young, earnest man named Peters. They had taken Marcus into custody, and Brody had confirmed Jacob's fears. "Croft owns the judge in this county," the sheriff had said grimly. "Don't expect the law to solve this for you tonight, Jake. He'll deny everything, and Marcus will keep his mouth shut. Croft will make his next move before we can make ours. You're on your own until we can gather a proper posse." So they prepared for a siege. Jacob barred the heavy front door and shuttered the windows, leaving small slits to see and shoot through. He checked his rifle and his Colt revolver, his movements economical and precise. He handed a second rifle to the sheriff. Eleanor watched him, her heart pounding a steady rhythm of fear and a strange, fierce pride. This was the real Jacob Thorne, not the taciturn recluse, but a protector, a warrior defending his home. "I can help," she said, her voice clear and strong in the tense quiet of the cabin. "Show me what to do." Jacob looked at her, at the determined set of her jaw and the unwavering courage in her eyes. He had tried to send her away because he thought she was fragile, but he saw now that her strength was simply of a different kind than his. It was quieter, but no less resilient. He nodded and handed her a box of cartridges. "You can reload," he said. "Keep the ammunition ready, and stay away from the windows." Night fell like a black shroud, thick and starless. The only light in the cabin came from a single, low-burning lantern on the table, casting long, dancing shadows. The minutes stretched into an hour, then 2. The waiting was a torment, every gust of wind sounding like a footstep, every rustle of leaves like an approaching enemy. They came just before midnight. The first sign was the frantic barking of Jacob's dog, followed by a single, silenced yelp. A cold knot of fury tightened in Jacob's chest. He moved to his position by the front window, peering through the slit. He could make out at least 4 dark shapes moving stealthily from the cover of the pines toward the cabin. "They're here," he said, his voice a low whisper. 4 of them, maybe more. The first shot shattered the tense silence, splintering the wooden shutter near the sheriff's head. The battle had begun. Gunfire erupted from all sides, the roar of rifles deafening in the enclosed space. Jacob and the sheriff returned fire, their shots measured and deliberate, aimed at the muzzle flashes that lit up the darkness. Eleanor knelt by the table, her hands moving with a speed and dexterity that surprised her. She opened the box of cartridges, her fingers fumbling at first, then growing steady. She lined them up, ready. When Jacob's rifle clicked empty, he fell back from the window, and she was there, pressing the fresh cartridges into his outstretched hand without a word. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second in the dim light, a silent acknowledgement of their shared purpose. He gave her a grim nod of thanks and was back at his post. The fight raged on. One of Croft's men tried to rush the porch and was cut down by the sheriff's steady aim. But another managed to get close to the side of the house, to a window that was less fortified. There was a crash of glass, and the barrel of a shotgun poked through the broken pane. Before Jacob could turn, Eleanor acted on pure instinct. She grabbed the heavy cast-iron poker from the hearth, and, with a cry that was part fear and part rage, she swung it with all her strength at the invading barrel. The impact jarred the man outside, sending his shot wild into the ceiling. Wood and plaster rained down. He swore viciously and tried to pull the gun back, but Eleanor held on, her entire body straining. It was a desperate, hopeless tug of war, but it bought them precious seconds. Jacob whirled around, his revolver barking twice. The shotgun clattered to the floor inside the cabin, and a heavy thump sounded from outside. He rushed to her side. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his hands checking her for injuries. "No," she gasped, her breath coming in ragged sobs, her arms trembling from the exertion. "I'm fine." He looked at her, at the soot on her cheek and the fierce, protective fire in her eyes, and his heart felt as if it would burst. She was magnificent, but the fight was not over. "They're trying to burn us out," the sheriff yelled from the other side of the room. A reddish-orange glow was beginning to flicker outside the far window. They had started a fire against the cabin wall. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced Jacob's composure. Fire. The memory of the heat, the smell of smoke, the terrible, consuming roar of the flames that had taken his family rose up to choke him. He froze, his rifle slipping in his sweaty grasp, his breath catching in his throat. The past was reaching out to claim him, to paralyze him. "Jacob!" Eleanor's voice cut through the fog of his terror. She gripped his arm, her fingers digging into his flesh, forcing him to look at her. "Jacob, look at me. That was then. This is now. I am here. We are here. We are not going to let him win." Her words were a lifeline. He looked into her eyes and saw not the reflection of his past horror, but the promise of a future. He saw her strength, her belief in him. He took a deep, shuddering breath, pushing the ghosts back into their graves. She was right. This was now, and he would not lose her, too. "The well," he said, his voice steady again. "We have to get water on that wall." But as he moved toward the back door, the front door suddenly shuddered under a heavy blow. They were using a log as a battering ram. The wood groaned, and the heavy bar he had set in place began to splinter. They were out of time. In that moment of impending doom, as the door began to give way and the smell of smoke grew stronger, Jacob knew with absolute certainty that he could not die without telling her the truth. He pulled her away from the chaos, into the small alcove of her temporary room, shielding her with his body. "Eleanor," he said, his voice urgent and raw against the din of the assault. "Listen to me. No matter what happens, I need you to know. The words caught in his throat, the words he had not spoken in 5 years. The main door crashed open. 2 men burst in, their faces demonic in the flickering firelight. The sheriff's gun roared, and one of them fell. The other, a hulking figure Jacob recognized as Silas Croft himself, leveled a pistol at the sheriff. Before Croft could fire, Jacob pushed Eleanor behind him and raised his own revolver. Tom seemed to slow. He saw the hatred in Croft's eyes, the greed that had led them all to this moment. He saw the sheriff, wounded, try to raise his weapon. He saw Eleanor, her face pale, but her eyes fixed on him. He and Croft fired at the same time. A searing pain exploded in Jacob's left shoulder, staggering him. But his own shot flew true. Croft grunted, a look of shocked surprise on his face, before he crumpled to the floor. The sudden silence was deafening. It was over. The surviving hired guns, seeing their leader fall, melted back into the darkness. The only sounds were the crackling of the small fire outside and the ragged sound of breathing inside the cabin. Eleanor rushed to Jacob's side as he sank to one knee, clutching his bleeding shoulder. "Jacob, you're hit." "It's nothing," he grunted, though a wave of dizziness threatened to overwhelm him. He looked from her terrified face to the dead men on the floor of his home. He had won. He had protected her. He reached up with his good hand and cupped her face, his thumbs stroking her cheek. "Eleanor," he whispered, his voice weak but filled with a fierce, desperate love. "I love you. I think I have from the moment I saw you standing on that platform, looking so lost. You walked into my life and made me want to live again, not just survive." Tears streamed down her face, washing away the grime and soot. She leaned in and pressed her forehead against his. "Oh, Jacob," she sobbed, a sound of profound relief and overwhelming love. "You fool. I love you too." The fire outside was quickly extinguished with buckets of water from the well. Sheriff Brody, his arm grazed by Croft's bullet, took charge of the grim aftermath. The threat was over. Silas Croft's reign of greed had ended on the floor of the very cabin he had sought to destroy. As the sheriff and his deputy dealt with the bodies, Eleanor gently led Jacob to a chair by the fire. She carefully cut away the fabric of his shirt, her touch infinitely tender. The bullet had gone clean through the fleshy part of his shoulder. It was a painful wound, but not a life-threatening one. As she cleaned and bandaged it with strips of clean linen, her movements were deft and sure. He watched her, his heart aching with a love so powerful it dwarfed the pain in his shoulder. When she was finished, she knelt before him, her hands resting on his knees. The first pale light of dawn was beginning to filter through the broken windows, illuminating the devastation in the room. But in the midst of the wreckage, they had found something whole and unbreakable. "You saved my life tonight, Jacob," she whispered, her eyes shining in the growing light. He shook his head slowly, reaching out with his good hand to gently touch her face. "You saved my heart long before you saved my life," he said softly, the words a profound and simple truth. "I was a ghost in this house, Eleanor. I was just going through the motions. You taught me how to feel again. You gave me a reason to fight." He slid from the chair, wincing with the movement, and knelt before her, so they were face to face. The room was a disaster. They were both covered in soot and grime, and he was wounded, but none of it mattered. He knew with a clarity that cut through all the pain and chaos that he could not spend another day of his life without her by his side. From a small wooden box on the mantelpiece, a box that had remained unopened for 5 long years, he took a small, simple gold ring. It had been his grandmother's. He had given it to Sarah once. Now it felt right to give it a new life, a new future. It was not about replacing the past, but about building on it, about allowing love to grow again from the ashes. "Eleanor Vance," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you are the strongest, bravest, kindest woman I have ever known. You have shown me that a home is not just walls and a roof, but the person you share it with. Marry me. Build a life with me here. Help me fill this house with light and laughter again." Tears welled in her eyes once more, but this time they were tears of pure joy. She looked around the damaged room, then back into his earnest, loving eyes. She had come west seeking employment and security. She had found something infinitely more valuable. She had found a home. She had found her heart. "Yes," she breathed, her voice filled with absolute certainty. "Yes, Jacob, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit, and as the sun rose over the mountains, flooding the valley with golden light, it illuminated the two of them kneeling amidst the ruins of the battle, creating a new and beautiful beginning. The town of Redemption Creek rallied around them. The story of the siege at the Double Pine Ranch became the stuff of local legend. The men who had once looked at Jacob with a mixture of pity and respect now saw him as a hero. The women who had gossiped about the mysterious Easterner now welcomed Eleanor with open arms and offers of help. They were no longer two solitary figures, but the heart of a community. Sheriff Brody, his arm in a sling, organized work parties. Neighbors arrived with lumber and nails, with fresh panes of glass and strong arms. The cabin was repaired, the bullet holes patched, the broken door replaced with one even stronger than the last. The women of the town helped Eleanor and Martha scrub away the last traces of the battle, filling the house once more with the scent of soap and beeswax and baking bread. Their wedding was a simple ceremony, held on the porch of the newly repaired cabin. The entire town attended. Eleanor wore a simple dress of pale blue, sewn for her by the other women. Jacob, his arms still healing but his eyes clear and bright, stood tall beside her. Martha wept openly with happiness, and Sheriff Brody stood as Jacob's best man. When a circuit preacher pronounced them husband and wife, a cheer went up that seemed to echo through the entire valley. It was a celebration not just of a marriage, but of survival, of community, and of the enduring power of love to rebuild and renew. 2 years later, the late afternoon sun cast long, peaceful shadows across the valley. The Double Pine Ranch was thriving. A new wing had been added to the cabin, and the corrals had been expanded. A field that had once been wild prairie was now green with hay, and the herd of cattle was larger and healthier than it had ever been. The lone stone chimney that had once been a monument to loss now seemed smaller, less significant, a relic of a distant past. Jacob stood on the porch, his arm resting on the rail. The lines of grief on his face had softened, replaced by the quiet contentment of a happy man. His shoulder ached sometimes when a storm was coming, a physical reminder of the night that had changed everything. But his heart was whole. It was more than whole. It was fuller than he had ever imagined possible. The screen door creaked open, and Eleanor came out to join him. She carried a sleeping toddler in her arms, a little boy with his father's stormy gray eyes and his mother's honey-colored curls. His name was Samuel, a bridge between the past and the future. She leaned against Jacob, resting her head on his good shoulder, and they stood in comfortable silence, watching the sky blush with the colors of sunset. The air was sweet with the scent of lavender from the small garden she had planted by the porch steps. "He was a terror today," she said with a soft laugh, her breath warm against his neck. "He managed to let the chickens out of the coop, and then tried to help Martha wash the floors. There was water everywhere." Jacob smiled, a genuine, easy smile that reached his eyes. "He has his mother's spirit, and his father's stubbornness," she countered gently. He turned and pressed a kiss to her hair, then looked down at the sleeping child nestled in her arms. He saw his son, his wife, his home. He saw a life overflowing with a love he had once believed was lost to him forever. He had everything. "I was just thinking," he said, his voice a low, contented rumble, "about that first day, standing right here, watching the train come in. I was so angry that it was breaking my quiet." He shook his head at the memory of the fool he had been. "I didn't know it was bringing me the only thing that could ever make the silence feel wrong." Eleanor looked up at him, her love for him shining in her eyes. "It was a very loud silence you lived in, Jacob Thorne." "It was," he agreed. He tightened his arm around her, pulling her and their son closer, a complete and perfect circle. "Thank you for teaching me the difference between silence and peace." They stood together as the last sliver of the sun disappeared behind the mountains, plunging the valley into the soft, purple twilight. The world was quiet, but it was not silent. It was filled with the gentle breathing of their child, the distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of the wind in the pines, and the steady, reassuring beat of two hearts that had found their home in each other. It was the sound of peace,